Hey everyone, just want to do a quick Merry Christmas from me and Mareska. Trust me, I asked her. She said Merry Christmas too.
DeadHatz.
Have you been to a theater recently and decided to view whatever the new horror release is, and then you find yourself maybe creeped out at certain moments or jumping at whatever's on the screen, but then you walk out of the theater and, after returning home, there's no lasting effect. There's no real fear obtained from the so-called horror movie. In fact, there's so little lasting effect that when you get home, you don't even find yourself even slightly inconvenienced when trying to sleep. Despite being a fan of, viewing mainstream horror, I would say there was nothing really released lately that really kind of bugged me in a scary, fun kind of way. Something that makes me stay up at night, all creeped out at whatever shadows are in the corner of my room and such. Now, of course, there are some outliers, but we are going to discuss those later in the video. And I know what you're going to say is, well, maybe as a kid you were scared. You grew up now, buddy, or, you just built up an immunity or tolerance to horror, but I think that isn't necessarily the case, or at least plays a much smaller role than a lot of people think it does. Although this isn't actually the case from my perspective, or at least my opinion. If that were the case, then I wouldn't be creeped out or scared of all the more indie and, smaller creator horror that we can find easily online nowadays. In many such cases, even to this day, I have viewed a video that really sent shivers down my spine. A video powerful enough to stick in the back of my mind throughout the day and creep me out even when I'm trying to do menial tasks or when I'm trying to go to sleep at night. So if it really was an issue of tolerance or growing up, then I really wouldn't be scared of that stuff, and yet I still do get scared of that stuff occasionally. The best example of this that I can think of is when I was browsing social media and I saw this simple 10-second clip. This one single video had managed to put an almost primal, animalistic fear into me that I rarely get to feel. Even a small rush of adrenaline had found its way into my bloodstream as my heart began racing just from one simple video. And the best part is, it doesn't even end there. Hours after viewing it, upon returning home from a shift at my job when I initially saw it, I had found myself struggling to unlock my front door as the lock at the time was currently, a little broken. Now at first my mind was empty, simply thinking of the day, the annoyance of the door, and the chilly winter air on my skin, until my brain decided this was the best time to remind me of that video I saw earlier in the day. Suddenly my thoughts of frustration turned into fear, as even though I was aware it wasn't real, I couldn't help but feel the glare of eyes on my back. My brain imagined the lady in the video in the bush behind me, staring at me, waiting for me to let my guard down. This panic in my body only added to the struggle of opening my front door, as the more panicked I was, the more my hand struggled with the keys in desperation, trying to find the right angle to open the door and get inside, where I could be safe from the woman in the video. All of this just from a simple 10-second clip you can find here on YouTube. So this begs the question again, what happened to mainstream horror? Now, in order to dive deeper into the topic, I think we should look at some more recent movies that have come out that didn't really work for me for one reason or another. Before I dive into the topic, I'm not going to say these are bad movies, like, these are horrible movies. I just, a lot of them I did in fact thoroughly enjoy. I just feel they don't really have that horrifying or lasting effect that I feel like a movie should have, or at least something with a big budget should at least be a little scary, you know what I'm saying? Now, before I dive into this topic, I do want to mention I will be spoiling bits of Pope's Exorcist, Smile, and Scream 6. None of the movies I'm about to describe would give me the feeling I felt at the front door trying to enter my house, but each had some merits, and let's discuss what they had going for it, and maybe why they weren't that scary. First is The Pope's Exorcist. This movie was actually kind of scary in some parts. It certainly made me jump at some parts, and some dialogue was really haunting, but sadly, I went out of it not really remembering too much. A couple scenes I literally forgot about until my rewatch for this video. And the story itself was honestly a little simple and basic and follows many tropes that these exorcism movies have. But the story wasn't the worst. It was actually kind of nice that they did a lot of research into the topics of how the Vatican actually works and real historical theories, which I found a little fascinating. But then you remember this isn't a docudrama and the quote-unquote scary parts come in. Where I think this film didn't work is that while being a little more unique than other Exorcist movies as far as research goes, the actual haunting and quote-unquote scary bits just really came off as more of generic, stuff we've all seen before. The possessed boy has telekinesis and can get inside your head to mess with you. That wasn't really that scary. Like, this is a case of, well, we've seen this before, and because of that, it really doesn't have many horrifying moments. If you're someone who doesn't ingest horror media that often, this may be scary, but to anyone who is at least skin deep in the horror community, you're not going to get much other than a couple jumps at some scares, really. Although, I will appreciate, like I said, the research they did on the film. It does list some real events that may seem a little esoteric, but those that are in the know will come off impressed in its viewing. Next, we're going to look at Smile, and this film overall was kind of a disappointment. This wasn't necessarily to the film's fault, as I have a friend who doesn't get scared easily who called me after viewing it, telling me it was the most horrifying movies he had ever seen. He stated it gave him trouble sleeping, so, I went to actually watch it in theaters when I was originally planning to skip it. After viewing, I find myself really liking a lot of the shots, the overall premise of the story, the monster itself being grief and depression, and spreads in a really nasty way that almost guarantees someone is going to be an emotionally shaky point upon, catching the monster. For those of you who don't know, the monster attaches itself to people in the chain, and the way to become the next link in the chain is to view the current victim commits in which place it will then pass on to you. As awesome as that concept was, seeing it playing out on screen was slightly disappointing. Sure, it had a couple scares, but their best one was used in the advertising, so I already knew that one was coming. Not to mention the monster's mental illness thing I've seen done a lot better in the web series Hi, I'm Mary Mary, which was done way better in my opinion. So having to go from something that did it amazingly to something that didn't quite hit the mark was honestly disappointing, and yet just another movie thrown into the list of ones that don't scare. Also, the fact that at the very end, the message of the story is, kill yourself. I don't think that's exactly the best message we want to send. Now, I understand, if you want your scary movie to have a bad ending, that's fine. I don't know, I just think it would have been a lot more rewarding to have it. This is one of the few times where I think a horror movie actually could have benefited from a good ending, but that's just me. And if you felt the same way, you're actually gonna like this video by a guy named Jack Saint called Please Stop Writing Modern Horror Like This. He actually goes super into detail on Smile, and you should definitely check that out, because that part did kind of influence this section of the video. Finally, the last movie I'm going to discuss is in a bit of trouble all on its own, and that is the new Scream 6. And this movie highlights not only an issue in current horror movies, but also in slashers period. Back when slashers were in their heyday, a lot of people found them terrifying. But this is a genre overall that I think lacks in the scary department, as a genre in my opinion needs innovation badly. Sure, a slasher movie is always going to be entertaining. I mean, who doesn't enjoy a good slasher? But I cannot think of the last time I have seen a slasher movie and thought, man, that was scary, or man, I'm going to have trouble sleeping tonight. Although I haven't seen the new Thanksgiving yet, and I've seen a lot of people hyping it up, so maybe that could change my mind, but I don't really expect it to. But yeah, none of the scares in the movie really got to me. It did decent jobs at building tension, but nothing really had me jumping out of my seat with my heart pumping, full of adrenaline. And the walk to my car in the dark in the parking lot, late at night, was not even remotely scary. So yeah, no real lasting effect really from this movie. So let's go over all these movies and what they had in common, and shows what they did that wasn't really working well in my opinion. Number one, they over-explained. There is no fear greater than the fear of the unknown. And almost every single one of these movies explained what was scary. I'm not going to say it explained it to thorough, completion, and I'm not going to say horror has to be unexplained to be scary. I just feel that once you explain something too much, when you give too much exposition, and I'm not going to say that all explained horror isn't scary, because there are some movies that, despite explaining a lot of the lore or world building of what's going on, they can still be kind of scary. For example, Sinister. That lawnmower scene stuck with me for a while after viewing the movie, despite the movie actually doing this very bit of doing a little too much explanation. So this isn't the only reason that these movies weren't scary, but it was definitely a part of it. Over-explanation really kind of haunted these movies. For example, Smile, I had already kind of pieced together what had happened before the big reveal of how the monster spreads, and then they just decided to show it, which is fine, but then just repeat kind of over and over, like have multiple revelation moments. It felt a little silly because the movie already kind of stated how the monster spread, and it just did it again. Like you're really trying to hammer in that this thing spreads by mental illness, and I feel like that over explanation really kind of killed any kind of fear of the monster, because when you tell me how the monster works so many times, I'm already hatching in my head how to beat it. Explaining a little bit of the monster is okay and even helpful, but over explaining can really damage a movie as far as fear factor is shown. Number 2, the stories can feel separate from the scares. If your story and your horrifying creatures are separate, it can cause a sort of divide in attention. I saw this a lot in The Pope's Exorcist. A lot of the segments in the movie had strange pacing. While I appreciate the amount of research they did, at a lot of times it felt like they were really expositioning us. And they didn't over-explain, but it felt almost as if the actual scary bit was put to the side so that they can world build. This can work in some movies, but in horror, I don't think it does that well. This is because it diminishes the urgency that a looming threat can have. If you take time to world build too much, then I can feel myself getting partially interested in what the movie is talking about and slowly forgetting that there's a threat in the background, and thus it relieves tension and makes it, well, less scary. Now, this can actually be used to put the audience in a false sense of security, which can work really well, but I didn't see this at all in any of these movies. If you coincide them and intertwine them better, I feel like it can actually build up more tension and make something stick more. Let us not forget, a jump scare can work even if you know it's coming. And number 3 is a lack of innovation. A lot of these movies I found myself thinking, I've seen this before, but in a different movie. All of these movies suffered from this. For The Pope's Exorcist, it showed a possessed kid doing demonic things, saying demonic things, doing telekinesis and the usual tropes. The only unique thing I hadn't seen was multiple possession, one demon controlling multiple bodies. That was pretty cool, but other than that, it didn't really stand out. All the scares felt like stuff we've seen before. Demon kid doing demon shit. For Smile, we saw the main character make dumb decisions, and the monster itself was a mix of It Follows and Hi, Mary, Mary. So yep, I personally have seen this one before. And finally, Scream 6 is a slasher, so almost everything on screen was something I'd already seen and did not impress me at all in that regard. But where am I going with all this? Do I just want to be a Debbie Downer and point out all the bad stuff in movies? Well, I did this to highlight how a big amount of current mainstream horror has a lot of flaws that could be worked on. We've seen a couple outliers come out in the past decade that suffer from almost none of these issues. And because of this, these movies managed to, shake me up and actually give me, a horror feeling after exiting the theater. Now I'm going to highlight some of the outliers and how they don't really have the flaws that I mentioned about these previous movies, and how a lot of them did a lot of new and relatively innovative things, and that is why they stand out as outliers, and even manage to have that longer lasting effect from viewing something scary that I was discussing earlier. Something that when the movie stays with you even past your initial viewing of the movie. Same as last section, I will be spoiling bits of Hereditary and Skinamarink. The latter being a bit more divisive. I'll get more into detail about that in our discussion now. First, let's discuss Hereditary, and if you haven't watched it, I would highly recommend you watch it. Don't let me spoil it for you. This is a movie you actually don't want to miss out on. But for those you stubborn folk or people who've already seen it, Hereditary follows a family through grief and manages to balance the story with the scares well. And in order for a movie like this to work, it actually needed to exposition the audience a lot, but it managed to do it in such a way that the core horror or main threat is still very unknown, even on rewatch. I had to watch the movie twice before I completely understood it, and I wasn't even frustrated by my confusion. In addition to that, any moment where they did dump a lot of info is still tied to the horror. The story never felt separate from what's scary. And not only that, it sometimes ended in a new horrifying revelation or scare. Thus, we never get a point where the viewer's attention is divided into being horrified and interested in the story. They're always intertwined and connecting with each other, so the divide in one's mind never actually occurs for this movie. As you saw in Smile and Pope's Exorcist, they would exposition you and divide your attention as mentioned earlier, but this movie managed to handle it pretty well, always following up a revelation with a scare or information that actually only makes the threat scarier. The fact that more information put more dread in your stomach and worsen with every bit learned is actually a really masterful thing to do. It kind of shows your expertise in that storytelling process. This, combined with the fact that we never actually did learn too much about the monster unless you really go back and watch the little tiny details, it led to a great combination of the fear of more knowledge and the horror of the unknown. Not only were you scared that you didn't know enough about the monster and felt you couldn't combat it, but learning more would only put more fear in you. Being left in the dark about certain parts was quite horrifying, but it's actually just as horrifying to learn more about it and find out just how unbeatable the creature is. In most horror movies, knowledge is the key weapon that characters can use in beating a monster. But when you saw how useless it was against Payman, it felt almost like reading a Junji Ito book at seeing how screwed the main characters were. This, and its ability to put dread in your stomach with such an amazing depiction as grief, is something I had never seen that well done before. And this was not only thanks to the writing, it was only strengthened by the amazing acting done by the cast of the movie. Their ability to reflect a grieving mother after losing her child, and a son who blames himself for the death of that child, it can lead to some very powerful scenes that they stay with you in almost a very dreadful feeling. I remember after watching this movie, it felt depressing to watch, but not in a bad way, like the movie put me down, but what the hell did I just see type of way. Because of its ability to avoid the flaws that the previous movies had, it managed to stand out as an outlier, and it's still mentioned a lot today when people bring up great horror movies in the past. The next movie we'll discuss is Skinamarink, which I won't go too much in detail on, as I already have made an entire video on it, and the opinions regarding this movie are actually quite divisive, many not understanding the premise, not because of their inability to be scared, but this movie has some prerequisites in order to fear it. If you have ever been scared of the dark as a kid or easily scared yourself as a child, then this movie will likely scare you in a nostalgic way that can almost grab you by your soul or inner child. However, if you haven't related to this fear before, or you don't have the issue of scaring yourself, then it will possibly be one of the most boring movies of the year that you will ever view. Since this movie did affect me, I will go into detail about where it worked for me in my experience. The first being that the entire movie relies on you having a fear of the unknown and understanding that the victims of the movie are borderline defenseless. It almost makes it also akin to Junji Ito, where no matter the actions of the characters, they will still lose almost 100%. Not to mention the victim of the movies being children would almost certainly still be scary to an adult, as anyone who's empathetic or likes placing themselves in the characters of a movie would almost probably be more scared at the thought of their child self being stuck in this situation. And not only that, parents who watch this movie could also find it scary, as they could imagine their own children in the horrible situation that the children find themselves in Skinamarink. This, combined with its aesthetic and use of low shots and low quality footage, almost gives freedom to one imagination to begin roaming. It uses the audience's brain against them. There are many times where the movie isn't even doing anything scary, but your brain actively works against you to make you see or hear things that are never even there. For example, when I was at the front door and I imagined the creature behind me knowing it wasn't there, this movie actively brings up a situation like that. It'll make you see things in the dark that aren't there. Your brain is working against you to make the movie scarier. Its ability to pull that off is very impressive, which is another reason why I hold this film in such high regard. Now, I'm not saying every movie needs to be as unique as Skinamarink. Like I said, it's divisive. A lot of people found it was boring. But Hereditary also showed that clearly you can shoot a movie and edit it like any mainstream horror film today while still avoiding these mistakes. And I think this kind of highlights the issues of mainstream horror, as let's look at what's available online compared to that in theaters and see how they compare up. If you have a certain fear or only certain ways that you can be scared, I can guarantee with almost 100% certainty that you can find something online that can, give you a good spook or scare. The internet is home to many different videos or stories that are hosting these many different fears, so there's almost something for everyone out there when it comes to horror. For example, that 10-second clip I mentioned earlier, I just simply found that while scrolling around on social media. If I actually went out and searched for more stuff that may scare you, I would more often than not find it. Sure, because of the plentiful amount, I have to do a little sifting through some mediocre or not as scary stuff, but I do think eventually I would find something that would creep me out or give me a good scare. I think the reason a lot of people fear that mainstream horror cannot compete with that of online horror is because mainstream horror is almost all catered to a more casual audience. Those who enjoy horror, but not as much as people who, like me, actually search out for it. And because of this, mainstream horror actually begins to alienate the audience of actual horror fans. As since the online horror community can evolve with the viewers, since someone out there is always going to try and make something scarier than the last big thing, it leaves the more common mainstream horror in the dust, since they haven't evolved much at all. The more mainstream horror you watch, the more you start to realize a lot of it is the same, as it still continues to be made for the casual horror audience again and again, as these are, well, to make a lot of money. It's why a lot of horror movies have sadly gone down the route of not pushing the boundary. It's why we also see a lot of horror movies being PG-13 or soft Rs, rather than the majority being rated R like it was way back when. When Hollywood realized that the casual horror audience is the majority, it only incentivizes them to make horror for them and not for the bigger horror fans. They do this without really realizing that if someone does become a horror fan, the last place they'll really look for something really scary is in their local theater. In fact, the two movies that put as outliers aren't really favored by the casual audience of horror. My mom, for example, I love her dearly, is what I would describe as a casual horror fan, and she described Hereditary as sick, and she would not watch it again, she said. I understand why, as the film's lasting effects could put someone in an almost sad mood, as its lack of a good ending and twisted nature of how the villain worked can kind of do that to people. And well, a lot of casual horror fans didn't actually enjoy Skinamarink, but a lot of those who are deeper and more well-versed in horror were able to find enjoyment out of it, even if it did come with a lot of slow bits that can feel very boring to a lot of viewers. I think understanding why mainstream horror isn't that scary anymore comes down to people just simply evolving beyond it. Mainstream horror these days is almost nothing more than a starting place for a horror fan. Those that watch horror to get the rush of being scared and being stayed up awake light because they're fearful of a monster around a corner will have to dive deeper and look elsewhere for something. I would not describe it as building an immunity to horror, as believe it or not, I still can get scared. I just mentioned two examples that scared me. It's just when the industry plays it so safe, it really starts to become less entertaining overall, since you've simply evolved to handle a lot more outlandish and innovative pieces to horror. Which, now that I think about it, sounds like a fancy way of saying you're getting immunity, so that's definitely still part of it. But I mean, remember when Mandela Catalog first came out? It did a lot of innovative new things that people hadn't seen before and thus took the internet by storm. But because it was so horrifying, it has now become almost industry standard. Many aren't scared of it anymore, and well, a lot of the copies of it feel too much like the original work. It's like that with Hollywood, except they never learn to evolve past it. They're still making industry standard. So it's not so much as everyone in the community is getting immunity to these movies, it's just we're ready to see the next big thing, and Hollywood has yet to deliver that. But how do you think modern horror is doing lately? Do you think it's, scary still, and there's still plenty of good scares for you, or are you finding it almost lacking or disappointing in the real horror department, the real staying power that movies used to have? I just find it a little frustrating that mainstream horror has almost refused to evolve with the rest of the, horror fans out there. A lot of the scares they use today are just rehashed or recycled versions of scares we've seen before in previous movies. In my opinion, it's not necessarily that we're all getting immune or too old to be scared of horror, but it's just a matter of horror has been staying the same in the mainstream without evolving with us. Horror in Hollywood used to be a place where real experimentation was going on. I mean, just look at The Shining. And well, if you look at it now, as far as horror goes, it hasn't really changed as much. But I hope you all enjoyed the video, and a Merry Christmas to everyone who's watching this. Obviously I dressed up a little bit for this. I didn't talk about a Christmas topic, but it's Christmas time, and this video was out before the New Year's, hopefully. So, I get to say Merry Christmas. Alright, bye everybody.
Subscribe to DeadHatz or you'll die tomorrow.